The System of Buddhist Practice by Venerable Rungruan Papa Saro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. Clearly, the Buddhist practice is not a practice to have a miracle, but it is a learning and implementation system to improve the quality of life. It is well explained by the Buddha. The Buddhism is about a journey in searching for the meaning of life, while cleansing all the defilements along the course of this journey. The Buddhist practice is a way to gain experiences resolving problems in life one by one. And in this study, after listening to the Buddha's words, then we have to experience the reality of life by performing the Buddhist practice. The real journey will not begin unless performing the Buddhist practice. The Buddhist practice is an introspective learning to fulfill the threefold study by performing an insight observation to gain insight wisdom. A life is a natural process, and whatsoever happening in mind processing is simply an effect of a certain course that is executed. As a life is a natural process, so does the Buddhist practice be a natural process as well. Whatsoever progressing in the practice is also an effect of a certain course of the right execution in accord to the Buddha's teachings. The realization of this phase is a fundamental key successful factor in performing the Buddhist practice, because the Buddhist practice is no secret like unexplainable miracles in the practices of other religions. In Buddhism, the origin of suffering in life starts at the uninstructed cognition, and a noble disciple is the one who develops an instructed cognition of the truths of life within nature. In the Buddhist practice system, the Buddha explained that a practitioner must have a mindfulness throughout the Buddhist practice, and by doing so, a mindfulness will progressively develop along the whole course of Buddhist practice. The Buddhist cognition requires to have a mindfulness to observe an insight of the mind. Therefore, the quality of mindfulness must be improved along with the practice. The focus of the early part of the practice is about how to improve the quality of mindfulness for performing an insight observation in the four mindfulness foundations, and then the mindfulness will reach a special condition of the mindfulness for an enlightenment, and then after gaining an insight wisdom, the mindfulness will finally become a perfect right mindfulness. From cognitive process development perspective, the system of Buddhist practice starts with an uninstructed cognition to become an instructed noble disciple, by which the development can be marked with specific types of mindfulness in alignment with the 37 factors for an enlightenment. The system of Buddhist practice consists of samatha and vipassana, starting with the mindfulness initialization to learn on how to initialize a mindfulness along with the mind processing, then reinitiating this mindfulness repeatability for having a mindfulness throughout the practice, and having a mindfulness faculty at the 6 sense bases to safeguard the mind from any stimulus every times when having a consciousness in the mindfulness development. Then the practice proceeds into the mindfulness meditation to develop an empowered mindfulness, so that the mindfulness will be sensitive to be able to detect even any slight changing in states of mind during the mind processing. The empowered mindfulness will cleanse all the 5 lower fetters in the course of thoughts, and the mind will dwelling into an inner mind of initial thought by performing the mindfulness absorption to abandon initial thoughts by proper liberated thinking, and by doing so, the mind will develop a special purified mindfulness to be used in performing an insight observation. Now we can perform an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations on the body, the feeling, the mind, and the Dharma, respectively, in order to observe all the mental phenomena within the mind, and then applying the 4 noble truths on the analysis of each phenomenon in order to contemplate the truths of life within nature by having the mindfulness for enlightenment. In performing an insight observation, the mindfulness will study the nature of each phenomenon in 7 aspects of considerations, such as the arising and fading away, cause and effect, the benefit and harm, and the way to liberate the mind from the object of consciousness. After then the observation will be extended to the whole mind processing to realize the process of dependent origination to gain a cognitive process of an insight wisdom for the cessations of the finest defilements at craving, clinging, ignorance, and taint respectively. The completion of the Buddhist cognitive process yields the perfect right mindfulness of an instructed cognition from insight for the cessations of craving, clinging, ignorance, and taint in the process of dependent origination to make an end to all kinds of suffering in life. And this is a way to be an instructed noble person in Buddhism. It should be fully understood that during the Buddhist practice the mind will be progressively improved from one milestone to another milestone, respectively. And since the mind is no self, therefore we cannot force the mind to reach to a certain state just by wishing, and therefore we have to learn what is the cause and effect of such progressive phenomenon during the practice, by knowing on how to initiate a process as a cause and effect, then we can reach a certain state as a result from the practice. In principle, the Buddhist practice is a way to study, and to have a mindfulness experiencing the reality of the truths of life within nature, especially in the part of how a mind responds to the world in terms of mind processing. This technique of study is quite unique, and only available in the Buddhism. In order to make a progression of mind developed, we must follow the Buddha's teachings correctly, that is, when having a right execution, and then the right effect will be accomplished as a result in nature. Therefore, studying the Buddha's teaching on how to perform a process to progressively reach a certain state of mind step by step, is very important in Buddhist practice. During performing the Buddhist practice in introspective learning, it is important to realize on what is the cause and effect precisely of every phenomenon in order to learn and to cognize of the reality of life. And as the Buddha proving a roadmap with intermediate accomplishments in each progressive step, we should make an assessment of the progress, and if necessary, a proper solution with corrective actions is required for an improvement. The Buddhist practice is an experimental journey in searching for the truths of life within nature. It is recommended that we should carefully study the Buddha's teachings as follows.
In Buddhism, the Buddhist practice means to be pleased with hearing the true Dharma. Studying on the Buddha's teachings with careful attention to contemplate on the true Dharma. Having mindfulness to practice in accordance with the Buddha's teachings to contemplate on the Dharma. Investigation on the true Dharma. Having mindfulness accompanied with wisdom for the cessation of all defilements. When performing the Buddhist practice, having a mindfulness meditation, with effort, so that the mindfulness becomes purified with no bias to any arising mental phenomenon, then performing an insight observation on Dharma, and then seeing the truths of life within nature, as what the nature is. This is the way to gain wisdom of knowing what is right and what is wrong, what we should do, and what we should not do clearly. This is the method to gain wisdom in the truths of life within nature, and this is called a study in Buddhism.
The Buddhism is a pragmatic religion based on facts and science. The Buddha encouraged everyone to learn the truths of life within nature, so that we can have a better understanding of life, and this is the way to bring peace to the world. The system of Buddhist practice is summarized in the following steps. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to initiate a mindfulness in the mindfulness establishment. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to use the mindfulness to abandon any arising troubling mind in the Buddhist meditation. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how cleanse the 5 hindrances, and then penetrating into the inner mind of the initial thought in the 5 hindrance eliminations. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to abandon the initial thought with liberated thinking in the mindfulness absorption. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to perform an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to apply the 4 noble truths to gain wisdom by applying the 4 noble truths on the observations both in terms of each phenomenon and the whole mind processing in the process of dependent origination. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to apply the gained wisdom for the cessation of all kinds of defilement at craving, clinging, and ignorance of the process of dependent origination by wisdom, so that the mind is completely liberated, and making an end to all suffering in life. The Buddhist practice can be compared like running a mind-cleansing execution routine within the mind of having a mindfulness to monitor a system of mind if there is any arising unwholesome state of mind, and when finding any, then abandoning it to reroute the mind processing into a right direction so that the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. In the execution of each iteration, it requires a good intention, a good effort, a good determination and a good investigation to complete the task. In doing so, not only each unwholesomeness will be cleansed, but also the 5 components of confidence, effort, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom will become strengthened up in terms of faculty and empowerment. As a cognitive processing of the mind is activated within the frame of the 4 mindfulness foundations. By now the mind is fully equipped with the 7 enlightenment factors for wisdom development, that is, mindfulness, research on Dharma, effort, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity, and in realizing the process of dependent origination with the application of the 4 noble truths, then the mind will gain insight wisdom of the truths of life within nature, and then using this insight wisdom to completely cleanse the origin of all kinds of defilements from the mind as summarized in the Eightfold Noble Path with great efforts. And this is the complexion of the Buddhist system of practice of the 37 enlightenment factors. As all defilements of mental errors and contaminates that arise within the mind processing are completely abandoned and cleansed out, the process of dependent origination will totally collapse, and then the mind is liberated and purified from any problem, and the individual will be able to respond to the world by taking the right actions, the Noble Eightfold Path, based on the truths of life within nature. And this is what the Buddhism is all about.